Howdy, folks. I've decided to do a little bit of a mini-series of things that have been on my mind, and a lot of what's been on my mind are things that are damaging society. Now, these are purely my own opinions, my own observations. Nothing that I state here is beyond a shadow of a doubt right, beyond a shadow of a doubt wrong. It's just a matter of opinion and observation. So, the first thing that has been on my mind that I've noticed ever since I was a kid in the late 90s and early 2000s are broken homes. Broken homes are one of the worst things in our human society, especially in America and the West. We have engineered the destruction of the family. We truly have. Families, you get two people who get together. They think they love each other, but they have no business being together. And they don't realize that till they're married, till they have kids, until life goes on. And then who suffers when it falls apart? The most. The kids. The kids grow up with damage. They grow up rudderless because it throws a wrench in the system of raising kids because they get passed back and forth between mom and dad. It throws a wrench in their morality, in their sense of right and wrong, their sense of what love is, because they see both mom and dad pursuing endless amounts of other partners. Some people can find a second partner and they're better than the first, and things work out. There are exceptions, of course, to many of these different variables. But in my experience, I've seen so much damage come from people who grew up in broken homes because their parents were selfish and they weren't even thinking. They weren't thinking about kids. They weren't thinking about family. They were thinking of themselves because at some point in American history, we started promoting this hyper-selfish ambition. And that extended to men and women and how they treat each other, to the point where now the very concept of starting a family is off-putting to people. There are entire groups of people who don't want to start a family because of all the variables that could go wrong. And they're not wrong for thinking that way. I don't think that they're entirely wrong. Some argue that, well, they should just get over it. It's not that simple. Guys are worried about being taken for a ride by a dishonest woman. And likewise, women are worried about the same thing with guys, and they're worried about being physically and emotionally hurt by guys. And it becomes this sense of distrust and people just wanting contentment and peace that they can't have otherwise if they're pursuing a deeper relationship with somebody. And they've seen, and then it also comes from, again, they've seen their parents, their grandparents, aunts and uncles, various people go through damaging relationships and create broken homes, and they've come from broken homes themselves, and they just go, I'm not even going to bother trying. I don't want to put any kids that I would have through that, so I'm not going to bother trying. And again, I don't think that they're entirely wrong. But the fact that it got to this point is really sad. Now, I didn't look anything up beforehand, but I'm curious as to when the epidemic of broken homes really started in America. Because if I look at history, I don't see this sort of thing. I see a lot of America going south by the 1960s, at least the mid to late 1960s. And I don't know if that's a generally agreed upon time period. It could be earlier than that. It could be later than that. But that tends to be what I'm seeing. And I'm bringing up my web browser here because I want to type in, and I should have done this beforehand, I apologize, but I want to type in, when exactly did the rates for things like divorce start to increase significantly? And what do people think the causes are for it? I think that the causes are a lot of things like government welfare, obviously. That's what damaged the black communities. Because if you look at pictures of the black communities from the 1950s, a lot of them were very good. Black families were together. Mom and dad were both in the pictures, and so were the kids. It wasn't that much different from a white family. But that all changed at some point. It changed drastically, and it's damaged entire generations of people. When did divorce rates increase in America? Divorce rates generally increased from the 19th century through the 1950s. The 1970s saw a larger increase in divorce rates. No-fault divorce was established in 1969 in California, and other states followed suit. This is from lovetoknow.com. I don't know how credible they are. Historic divorce rates. All right, they have late 19th century 0.05%, 1900 to 1930 0.11%, 1930s 0.17%, 1940s 0.28%, 1950s and 60s 0.24%. So actually, it seems to have gone down in the 50s and 60s, which surprises me. It was higher in the 40s, but there was a lot going on in the 40s. There was the Second World War. They had come out of the Depression in I believe that was the 1930s. 1970s, it skyrockets to 0.40%. 1980s, it increases to 0.50%. 1990s, it drops a bit to 0.44%. 2000 to 2007, 0.37%. And 2011 to 2021, 0.30%. And I think a lot of that has to do with, at least when you see in 2000 to 2010 and 2011 to 2021, you're just not seeing as many people getting married. They still are getting married, but you're not seeing it as much. But its highest points seem to have been 1940s, 1980s, and it dropped off from the 1990s onward, but yet interesting. Generally increased from the 19th centuries to the 1950s. 1970s saw a larger increase in divorce rates. No-fault divorce was established in 1969. U.S. has generally seen a decline in divorce since the start of the 21st century. Divorce rates from 1900 to 1930 were low, but data is lacking. Okay. Yeah, at a certain point, these things are not really being recorded like they are. So it's hard to tell. But we see a lot of the idyllic pictures of the 1940s and 50s and 60s of couples being together. What I want to know is how they increased from the 1950s onward. And there's a couple of different charts here. I don't know how reliable this source is. All right, we've got Business Insider. Divorce rates over the last 150 years. The biggest increases in divorces was between the 60s and 70s. This is what I've generally understood to be true based on my own research, but that's what this article in Business Insider is saying. Since the turn of the 21st century, divorce has been on the decline. See, a lot of people are saying that divorce is on the decline, but again, when I was growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, it felt like every other person we knew either had divorced parents or were divorced themselves. Interesting. From 1867 to 1879, the annual divorce rate was 0.3% divorces per 0.3 divorces per 1,000 Americans, excuse me. That's nuts. So obviously something was keeping people together. At the turn of the century, the annual divorce rate rose to 0.9% divorces for every 1,000 people in a given year. As the country entered World War I in the 1910s, each year there was still only one divorce for every 1,000 Americans. Again, war, depression. During the Roaring 20s, the divorce rate climbed up to 1.7 divorces for every 1,000 Americans. See, the 20s were an interesting sort of period based on everything I understand about them. It was sort of an anomaly, much like we see over several decades. It was an anomaly decade. It wasn't normal. And they say during the 20s, women continued to gain their independence as they embraced the life of a flapper and started dating publicly. Challenging traditional gender roles, many women chose to stay single longer instead of getting married young. The number of divorces increased to 1.7 per 1,000 people in 1928 and 1929, with 200,000 divorces, which at the time must have seemed like insanity. There was a bit of a cultural revolution in the 20s. I believe this was around the time of things like Prohibition and things like that. Wasn't that also the Depression as well, though? I consider the 20s and 30s. I kind of blend that whole era, those two decades together, those 20 years. Even as somebody who's a history buff, I'm not as well versed on that era of time as I should be. I need to research it far more, admittedly. At the start of the 1930s, the yearly divorce rate briefly dipped, but then climbed again to 1.9%. 1.9, I keep doing that. I apologize. At the start of the 1930s, the yearly divorce rate briefly dipped, but then climbed again to 1.9 divorces for every 1,000 people. When the Great Depression hit in the early 1930s, a poor labor market meant that many women. Yeah, okay, it was the early 30s. All right, so the time frame wasn't terribly off. That was the start of the Great Depression, was the early 1940s. Then the next decade, they had World War II. Man, what a difficult 20 years. What a difficult 20 years. We haven't seen anything yet in the 21st century, guys. Something's coming. When the Great Depression hit in the early 1930s, a poor labor market meant that many women had to rely on men again for money. During this time, the divorce rate slipped from 1.6 per 1,000 people in 1930 to 1.3 in 1933. Love in the time of the Depression, the effects of the economic conditions on marriage in the Great Depression, postulates that marriages formed during tough economic times were more likely to survive compared to matches made in the more prosperous time period. And that makes sense. People just want to survive, and they can't survive alone. So they need to be with somebody. Whether or not there's actual love there remains to be seen if it lasts for the next several decades, if they're married in the early 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, so on and so forth. I don't know what year my grandparents were married. I'd have to ask my folks. But both my mom's side, my dad's side, their parents stayed together throughout their entire lives. You know, the first one to go was my grandfather on my dad's side in the 1980s, and then my grandmother on my dad's side passed in 2004. My grandfather on my mom's side passed in 2012, and then my grandmother, I believe, I want to say 4 years later, but no, it wasn't 4 years later. I don't remember what year. It was a couple years later. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, unfortunately. And unfortunately now so does my mother. So we're having to deal with that one day at a time. But my father and mother have been together since the 1970s. So take for that what you will. So I don't come from a broken home per se, or too many broken homes. I have many aunts and uncles who have been divorced and remarried several times, and several who didn't. So, but there was at some point, I feel like there was a massive spike in divorces in American culture, and it has just led to so much damage. Now, to be fair, not all divorces are just because the two selfishly don't get along. There's obviously things like abuse and people just being horrible people to each other and to their children. That makes sense. But again, those are people who shouldn't have got together to begin with. But there's all sorts of complexity and layers to it. But my point is, I'm not even going to continue to read the rest of this. You guys can research the rest on your own. This is something I'll be looking into a little bit more. My overall point is, damaged and broken homes due to divorce are causing so much of today's attitudes. I'm convinced of it. Because a lot of those people who grew up when I was a kid and even older in the 80s and 70s and so on, they're now adults. They have kids. And a lot of them haven't made the best choices either. But a lot of that is because they didn't have good influence. They didn't have solid examples of a not broken home or of good relationships. You see so much vapid narcissism in relationships today from both men and women. I know some people want to blame women, some people want to blame men. I personally blame both. I think that there's blame to go around. There are some things that are worse on one gender or the other, but they both contribute to the overall state of how things are today. It takes two to tango. It definitely takes two to tango. You've got a generation, I'll put it this way. You've got a generation of women who are growing up incredibly entitled, sort of a princess mentality. And they think that entitles them to treat men however they see fit as opposed to how they should treat men. And then you've got a generation of men who are in their 20s now who are effectively little boys who can shave. And they don't want to take any sort of personal responsibility. They don't want to be strong. They don't see any reason or incentive to be as long as other people can. You combine these two sort of toxic mentalities and you get a disaster. You get an absolute disaster. And then you have people in my generation who have similar mentalities. Not all, of course. There are many of us who have more traditional mindsets and are trying to pursue more traditional ways of living and relationships. You know, people who are more God honoring. They're trying to live a more biblical lifestyle or more conservative style of living. But you've also got a contingent of us who are trying to live as they see fit and live selfishly, and they're just not good people to be around. They're really not good people to be around. They're not selfless people. They're not humble people. They're incredibly selfish, vain, narcissistic. They're the ones who are on social media endlessly praising themselves and trying to get praise from other people. And a lot of those people come from broken homes. Broken homes are one of the worst things to happen to American culture. Whenever they started, whenever they spiked, they're one of the worst things to have taken place in American culture because an entire generation of kids are born broken. Broken almost beyond repair. They can't get good relationships. They don't know what true love is. They're not able to find it. On rare occasions, you might get people who learn from the mistakes of their parents and learn from the mistakes of their ancestors, and then they end up doing better. They have good, honest families. They're raising good kids, and they're breaking a generational chain. I think that's kind of what took place with my parents. Even though my grandparents were still together, there were still a lot of bad habits. My grandfather on my dad's side was an alcoholic. It took him years before he could break that. But my dad kind of broke that chain when he came to Christ. And so he lived a better life. They loved and raised their kids. And we saw, you know, when we were growing up, we saw mom and dad argue, but we never saw them hate each other or other people. They were incredibly selfless people, and they still are today. And that has rubbed off on me and my sisters. And we're doing the best that we can. My sister is raising her two daughters, and she's doing the best that she can, and they've both turned out very good. In a world where it's very hard to have your kids turn out good. And they're getting older, so there's going to be more challenges, but for the most part, they've turned out very, very good. So I don't want people to think that things are impossible because of these elements that are damaging society. They are possible, but it's a tougher world to navigate than it used to be in many ways socially. A lot of stuff has not changed, but a lot of stuff has gotten worse. A lot of problems that persisted through earlier decades have increased in volatility. And it has created a lot of problems. So that's the first thing on my mind about what's damaging society. You'll have to let me know what you think about the epidemic of broken homes that took place for many years. Again, I don't know if you can pinpoint it. Maybe somebody in the comments can pinpoint when it was so common and why they believe that that's the case, but I'm not entirely sure. You'll have to fill me in the comments below based on what you've observed. So be sure to leave a comment down below. As always, try to be respectful. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Super Koopa TV. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.